welcome back to another episode of Finding Peak. So grateful that you continue to join us and participate in this with us. I hope that we are continuing to teach, educate, or otherwise about this industry, about this space, its complexities, its simplicities, its beauty, its frustrations, everything in between.
All of the things.
All of the things. For me personally, I just love coming to do these things, especially with you guys.
It is great.
I think a few times I've missed title giving, but again, Jason Friesma, Chief Clinical Officer, Peaks Recovery, Chief Operating Officer, Clint Nicholson, everybody, and Chief Executive Officer, Brandon Burns, just in case anybody's joining us for the first time. And welcome back for everybody else. So we have a blog on our website called Psychological and Emotional Manipulation, and it gets a lot of people visiting that particular page. And so we just kind of wanted to highlight, what that means in relationship to, I think, two different things, right? There's two ways, I think, to look at psychological and emotional manipulation from an addiction treatment space. One, those things can cause shame, guilt, emotional feelings that might drive us towards maybe using drugs and alcohol one day to, cope with those experiences. Also, for family systems out there, when we're engaged with an individual who is suffering from an addiction, we experience psychological and emotional manipulation, abuse, and so forth. And so I think just to kick this off, I think let's start with maybe the cause and effect relationship of it. When we experience psychological and emotional manipulation, over time can have us experiencing guilt, shame, and so forth. And then we end up turning to drugs and alcohol maybe to cope with that. I know we talk a lot about the latter part of the topic about clients, patients themselves manipulating family systems, but let's talk about it maybe through the client lens and your experiences as clinicians and what that's like for our patient demographic to experience those things and resulting from that moving towards drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. So I don't think there's a question in there.
Not yet. I'm waiting. And Clinton's answering first. Yeah.
But I feel like it's nestled in there. You're in a clinical session and you're talking with individuals. Mm-hmm. What is it that comes up often in your experiences in regards to that manipulation that they experience, for which they are stating, these are reasons that I'm participating in, drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism?
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind with that question is certainly working with some of our younger adult population, and sometimes there are parents out there that can be a little bit manipulative with their adult children, and sometimes that manipulation can occur with good intention, like trying to get somebody to do the right thing. And I guess, overall, I look at manipulation, to me, is trying to change somebody's behavior without kind of overtly stating your intention, and trying to maneuver situations in ways that, are manipulative. And actually, I was just, during our family meeting recently, I was talking to the families about dishonesty, and of course, every family on the Zoom meeting was like, "Yeah, it's awful," and like it was so horrible. And then I asked families, "In what ways have you been dishonest with your loved one who's here at Peaks?" And the call went a little quiet for a second, and then I kind of described how even as loving as it may be, but not speaking the truth to your loved one and trying to change their behavior through maybe just hiding things or withholding money or withholding love or attention as a way to try to change somebody's behavior is a way to be manipulative. And regardless of what the intention is, it still can kind of come across and be perceived as manipulation. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. Nicholson.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is like you said, or we're kind of alluding to this sort of push of manipulation to motivate either trauma or guilt or shame and then utilizing substances as a coping mechanism or a primary coping mechanism. I think that we are surrounded by manipulation of sorts at all times, right? Whether it's, I think that manipulation, we just assume that it's this negative thing, but we're being manipulated by advertisement, we're being manipulated by social media, we're being manipulated by peers. It's all around us, you know, like and it's this idea of trying to, again, change behavior or promote behavior in a certain direction. And I think there comes a point where there is from the addict's perspective, where there is a loss of self and then a loss of control. And one of the easiest ways to gain back control, particularly emotionally, is through substances. They're effective, they're predictable, and they are accessible, unfortunately. So that's when I think about manipulation as far as driving or motivating substance use, that's what I come back to. And then once you're in that substance use world, when you're in the realm and sort of culture of substance use, I think the manipulation just gets even greater. There's a whole, it's almost exponential once you're in there, because you're in a group of people and part of a population that is 100% in survival mode. And so, and you do anything you can to survive. Manipulation is probably a baseline almost to a certain degree. And so, yeah, that's kind of where my mind goes.
I think it's an excellent point, because it is true that we think about it in terms of that negative approach, right? Because there are, you know, certainly in appreciating and understanding phone calls that we get, you know, coming into, you know, Peaks Recovery from family members. It's like, look, if I tell them they're not getting their cell phone when they go to treatment, they're not coming. And that doesn't matter what treatment center is involved with that, they're just not coming, right? And so, you know, at times there's this sort of good cop, bad cop thing that starts happening. And if we had to couch it in terms of, you know, positive terms, it would be a harm reduction principle, right? The individual's life is out of control, and I'm going to manipulate in this sense to bring them into care, but the value proposition will be they'll be better off than they were to begin with. But, you know, at the same time, in a family system that's, you know, maybe negotiating that even with the best of intentions, and the person's life is spiraling out of control at the same time, we're sort of slowly but surely, if not rapidly, losing trust, right, within the family system. And that's a delicate line. And I appreciate it, Klings. I didn't think we were going to go in this direction of like the positive aspect about it, but now it just makes it all the more challenging, it feels like, from that family perspective. And because it does feel that there are times in which it has like a value proposition in that regard. But at the same time, I think in relationship to, you know, family systems and so forth, not just so we don't get off topic about it, but what is it about those, you know, going back maybe to the family phone call that you had, Jason, about those experiences, you know, what were families able to get honest about as examples of dishonesty on their side of things?
Well, I think I find that manipulation and particularly the use of shame as a motivator to get people to go to treatment or to try to get people to change is the one that I think families were able to take the most responsibility for. Like, and you know, as Brene Brown talks about, like, shame is a great motivator in the short term, but it doesn't create long-term and systemic change. Like, it can, you know, you can call somebody a name or tell them they're worthless or whatever, as a, you know, you're being worthless, I need you to, you know, how you would find worth basically would be to get your life together and do this. And that might provide a little spark to get somebody moving in a proper direction. But it is actually damaging, obviously, significantly. And then, you know, the other big one that I was thinking about as well as we were talking is gaslighting. Like that seems like, I don't know, kind of a term that gets used a lot lately. But certainly, you know, and that's where somebody blames their own behavior on another person. Like, you know, I wouldn't yell at you if you would come home on time, or I wouldn't have all this stress, or I wouldn't have my heart problem if you would get your life together, or whatever. And that can, like, again, there's a nuance there. Like, some of that can be real, and there's a genuine way to share, like, hey, your behavior is affecting me in this way. But there's a manipulative way around saying, like, I'm not going to take responsibility for how I'm speaking to you. This is your fault. You brought this onto yourself, basically.
Yeah, manipulation is very much a single direction street, right? It's a one-way street. It's much more about, there isn't like a reciprocation of ownership in the moment, and so it becomes just blame, basically.
Yeah.
And once you've started to blame somebody for the devastation that is your life, or the chaos that's in your life, and you don't take any ownership of it, shame is the result. And then once you're in shame, again, I mean, like Jason said, there's that maybe initial motivating factor, but then the shame actually becomes the motivation to continue the cycle, because you start to feel worthless. You start to feel like you don't have any power. You start to feel like, I'm the reason why everything is wrong. You actually start to believe and own these things. And that's, again, especially if you're doing that in the context of somebody who has substance use, once you start to feel out of control, you go back to what you know. And again, substances are really great at that. Like, they're very predictable, and they give you a sense of control. So yeah, short term, you may see some movement or nudge in the right direction. Again, knowing that manipulation is really about motivating change and behavior. But in the long term, what you've done is, in those moments, is actually just sort of reinforce a cycle that you're actually trying to break.
Yeah. And thinking about the word gaslighting in that regard, in reference to, or just creating an additional example about it, because, I always tell, I think the solution here becomes like positive boundary setting, right?
Yeah.
And so we'll slide into that, within this as the solution. But, I hear a lot from families as well too, that, okay, I went to hold a boundary and I went to talk to my loved one, and then they turned around and said to me, well, if you don't give me that $100, then I can't pay rent, or I don't get that $100, and then I'm going to be on the drugs, or on the streets, and, unfortunately at times within this industry, potentially prostituting myself and all that sort of stuff that we know happens, to individuals. Is that kind of a gaslighting effect?
Absolutely.
Of
yeah.
like,
and that's one that I've seen a lot of. Like, I've certainly talked to parents who have, gone to the heroin dealer and paid for the drugs themselves, or definitely pay rent every month, even though all these other behaviors are going on. And then are frustrated because their boundaries of, like, my boundaries that they'll quit using. Well, boundaries are something you set to protect yourself. It isn't to change another person's behavior, right? And even that, that's kind of weaponizing boundaries. If it's like, I'm going to set a boundary to get Clinton to change. My boundary is just that, like, if this behavior of Clinton's continues, this is what I'm going to do as a result of that to make myself safe again. That's what a boundary is. That other stuff is just, it's aggravation, and it's disguised as a boundary. It probably is its own manipulation, but I don't think that's in the blog. But
I mean, I think you slip into the realm of manipulation, right? And then maybe that's when we start to talk about the other side of that, like the family as sort of maybe more of a victim or the recipient of those sort of manipulative behaviors. And again, I think for me, it's when I think of manipulation from the part of an addict, I just see somebody in survival mode. That's all they're doing is surviving, and all they want is to to gain control back. And again, the way they know how to do that is to continue using. And I think that's on a psychological level and on a physiological level. And again, there's nothing you can really do as a family member to change that. They have to make the change. And so you get into the pattern of, I'm going to set these, what I feel are boundaries in order to try to motivate changes in behavior, but really what you've done is just continued, again, that cycle of manipulation. And it becomes very quickly, that's when it's a two-way street, because it's just manipulation, exchange at that point. But establishing those healthy boundaries, like Jason was talking about, that's actually how you break the cycle. And it becomes about protection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than survival, it's about safety, you know? And I think that that's one way to frame it for families that actually gives them a sense of power back. And that's how you start to regain control and sort of mitigate the chaos.
Right.
Because that boundary discussion actually creates a huge barrier to relationship. Whereas if my boundaries, I'm not giving you any money if you're using, and that's just my boundary.
Right.
And then your son or daughter calls and is like, if you don't give me $100, I'm going to get kicked out of my place. A well-established boundary gets to say, that sounds really hard and scary. What are you going to do? Because I'm not handing you the money.
Right.
But like the boundary's already set, and I'm not here to change. I'm not here to now stop your addiction.
Right.
I'm here to say, I'm emotionally here for you, but I'm not financially here for you because the finances are just going to the dope dealer.
Right. Or the response, when I think a typical response would be, well, I'll do it this time, but
Yeah.
you have to do this
Right.
for me.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Oh,
So,
yeah.
There's that sort
You
of
quit and I'll
bartering.
do it. Yeah.
Right. Which is
Yeah.
again just another it's a more cordial manipulation, I guess.
Yeah.
And that feels better. Like you're starting to if I do this and there's this exchange, then we're starting to get control again. The chaos is starting to sort of dissipate. But no, it's just an exchange. You know, where you're just continuing the cycle. So.
Right. So there's a delicacy to it there. So how, and you're the only father figure, at least in this room with us right now. So
You have the biggest beard. So-
and the
need to
biggest
brag, but I
beard
do.
in
Yeah,
this room.
absolutely. I
It's
do.
getting cold here in Colorado, so this is what we do.
It grows exponentially.
But
I'm
in
really proud of
regards to being a father, I can imagine it's extraordinarily challenging to hold these boundaries. And fortunately, knowing your family, of course, that's not the space you're in. But I always share with families, and I think we do, that when you go to set these boundaries for your own emotional safety, what you're going to hear back, well, then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to live on the streets, or I'm going to be in the trap house, and all these sort of things, that immediately pulls on the motherly and fatherly heartstrings. And I think it's, so difficult for people to conceptualize that the boundary isn't actually severing those strings, and that emotional state still exists. And maybe from that parental lens, I can imagine just thinking about it, for you even with your kids, how difficult that would be to set those boundaries, for your own emotional safety, and maybe just in that intimate sort of way, walk family systems through, from that parental lens, that challenge and what that might be like, for you if you're in the same. Because it's sometimes easy to give advice. It's another one to kind of internalize it as if it were going to take place in our own.
Yeah. And to your point, I haven't been in the situation where one of my kids is saying, I need $100 or I'm homeless. But what is clear is as a parent, my kids struggle sometimes with anything. And the easiest thing to do would go fix it. But that doesn't teach anything. It doesn't build resilience. And so always my strategy is, or what I'm always thinking is, what's most important is my relationship with my kids. And that they're calling me or talking to me about this problem kind of puts us on the same team, and the problem is over here, and how do we navigate this? And this problem is not my problem. I get to have that boundary for the most part, but how do we want to navigate that? Because don't get me wrong, and if my daughter calls from college and is having a hard time, my instinct is to go rescue her or go solve the problem. First instinct, for sure, immediately. So it feels against my instinct to just sit and talk to her and allow her to solve her own problem, even if it's hard. But then, that grows her resilience and her ability to kind of, grow and learn. And I don't want to be rescuing her when she's 30. So I probably should help her engage life at 18.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Feedback? on it? I know it's, I
I
know
mean,
it's
yeah,
largely
like,
directed
I'm
at
not-
him, but
Share
Yeah,
your
not-
expertise on
my
that. Quinn.
expertise as a parent, yeah. I
Yeah.
have a dog and 2 cats.
So in Hank,
Yeah, Hank, my dog, if he were to come to me. Yeah, it's like, if you don't get this money, I can't get bones. You know, I don't know. I think about that when you talk about that, the idea of severing the connection, that these boundaries feel like you're severing, but really what severs the connection between family and between family members is actually the back and forth between manipulation. That's what, it's like you're constantly sawing that connection. Every time you go back and forth with those manipulations, you're actually making it more and more tenuous. And to establish these solid boundaries is the first way to heal that. So I think from a visual perspective, it's one way to think about it, but that's really what will cause that eventual sort of snap or severing of the connection between family members is the back and forth, because you lose being genuine and authentic with one another, and everything becomes about one-upping the other person rather than just stopping and, like Jason said, being there and listening to them, you know, and not trying to solve the problem, but just help them understand the problem. Yeah, that's my feedback.
and I'm sure there are families that are suffering, and that sounds very Pollyanna-ish.
Absolutely.
Like very much like, oh, that's great, Jason, but like your kid's not about to die, and that's
It's true.
true. And I want to acknowledge that. The stakes are higher oftentimes when dealing with substance abuse, but I don't think severing the relationship, I think, is the actual enemy in all of this.
Absolutely.
And I do think there are times to lean into like if you have a lot of cachet, if you will, in the emotional bank account with your kids, then you can lean in and push at times, I think. And then there are other times that you have to just support from a distance and let your loved one know that there's always a warm meal and a listening ear. And that's
Yeah.
about it.
and
Not
we
cash.
Yeah.
and we've talked about boundaries, and because it seemingly comes back to boundaries a lot on this show, because they are so effective when they are understood. And the powerful thing that, I think we've lightly said it in past episodes, but the powerful thing about a boundary is not a line in the sand to direct or change the course of someone's behaviors, right? It is back to, I am safe in this moment. So, I shared with a mom a while ago, I said, what is it like to get a phone call from your loved one? Well, I think it's the last phone call. I think it's somebody on the other line going to tell me he's dead, that he got in a car accident and killed somebody because of his drinking and so forth. And I said to her, like, that does not sound safe. I can only imagine what it's like to pick up a phone, like if my loved one called, and to have that energy. We want to answer that phone when it's loving, it's positive, they're sharing in their goals, inspirations, or maybe even sharing in negative features that are taking place in their lives that, we can support and encourage, but we can't be in sort of that 911 call space at any given time. And so, maybe just kind of carrying this episode out again, how can we convey to individuals, family systems, and also as well too, I think if anything, right, start talking to, before you're, what is it in America? It's to 22 million people suffering from mental health and addiction. That's 330 million Americans or something like that. So just shy of 10% of our population is going through this at any given time. And we've seen a variety of family systems coming into Peaks Recovery Centers that come from all walks of life. This happens to all walks of life. At some point, I think, we can start setting emotional boundaries and safety early on, before we even know there's an addiction taking place, before we get into that, risky behavior of sort of drawing the line in the sand in that regard. So, how can we support families, I guess, on the, before we head out here, in regards to, again, just reminding what those boundaries are, how to reinforce them, and how to have earlier discussions about their own emotional safety before it gets to that moment where we might be gaslighting or sliding into manipulative behaviors.
Well, to that example you just gave, as horrific as that is, and who would want to just be on edge and that every phone call might mean that this is the one? To your point, that is a tough way to live. And honestly, the first boundary I thought of is so practical and simple, but it would be to put your phone in a different room when you go to bed, and at least create 8 hours of a buffer, and just say, if a call comes at 2 a.m., there probably isn't really much I can do anyway. And I know that can sound so cold and callous, but like boundaries, you can't live like you're an ER doc 24/7, 365. Like I need to be ready to jump at a moment's notice. Like that's not a practical solution, and the only way is probably some sort of physical boundary like that, where that's how that's going to go. And I know, so conceptually, that's what the boundary is saying, I need to create this safe space for me. Or I'm not going to take calls that aren't in my contact list, or I'm not even going to let calls ring through that aren't on that, or whatever it is that you may need, to whatever degree feels right. And boundaries are meant to also be fluid. Like there might be a season. You might need to take a month and just turn your phone off at night. And then see where you are and reevaluate. Maybe that felt better, or maybe that felt worse. I don't know, but learning that taking care of yourself is actually an important part of establishing your own mental health and your own ability to be stable. Because the fact is, when that call comes, if you do get the call from your loved one, like you're probably going to need some energy, some emotional. You're going to need some reserves in the bank anyway to offer that support if that call comes. So.
I mean, I love that you had like a really pragmatic answer. So that's
I know.
sweet.
So can you give us more of a
Language.
feeler one,
Yeah.
Clinton, since we're
Can you do
switching
feels
roles
on this
maybe?
one?
I mean, gosh, I'll give it the old college try here.
Okay.
I think it's about, boundaries are a lot of times about resilience in general, right? So I think that if we're talking about like before this even happens, like what are some of the things that we can do to help build boundaries within a family system, regardless of if there are issues going on. I think that resilience and being a family that comes together to communicate about problems and not actually necessarily try to solve them. I think that parents in general, and this has been my experience as a child, so
Okay.
particularly fathers, at least my father, there's this impulse is to solve the problem. Kid says, I have a problem, well, what are you going to do about it, right? Rather than just sitting there and saying, all right, you have a problem, let's sit with the problem for a while. What does it feel like to have a problem? And what does it feel like to resolve and just be in slowly but surely
feel.
through. I know, I said feel
it's
like
amazing.
way too many times.
Yeah.
I'm good for the year.
Cashed it all in.
Yeah, gosh, right. I've just been waiting. So, yeah. But actually sitting with that and getting used to being in discomfort, right? I think that when we try to run away from discomfort is when we get into problems. When we try to protect ourselves from it and we try to avoid it and we try to problem solve our ways out of it, I think we're going in the wrong direction. It's okay for things to not be okay. Mm-hmm. And so, and being able to sit in that space as a family, I think if you can do that as a family system, I think you've got a pretty significant leg up. And I think that all of the members of the family at that point recognize that at least have the beginning tools to be able to establish clear boundaries and healthy boundaries moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in going out here, and I appreciate that. That was excellent.
You're welcome.
Pragmatic feels we switched.
It'll never happen
up
again.
is down.
You'll never see that again, viewers. That was
It's a Freaky Friday.
there was a lot of vulnerability in this room, and I could feel it. Just and I think in going out here as well, the thing that comes to my mind about this is that your loved one is suffering. There is no doubt about that, and whatever they're going through, mental health, primary, substance use disorder, they are suffering. And I think the goal of a boundary is to not be suffering at the same level, and to provide some space in that regard so that you can still get, as wild as it may feel, or me saying it, a good night's sleep while that's happening in the background, because your life matters just as much as your loved one's life in that regard. So boundaries is to take care of self and support the individual in a loving way. And so thanks again for being here on this episode today at Finding Peaks. I got a special, exciting guest coming up in a few weeks here, Joanna Conti with Vista Research, president and founder of Vista Research and Conquer Addiction. They're the nation's largest outcome data collection agency that exists in the country. And so no more fluff about outcomes. We're going to talk about it specifically, what she's seeing on her end in that regard, what frustrations she's seen about treatment centers and their experiences in regards to this. But she's got a big heart. She's doing something really extraordinary in our industry. It's been wonderful to have them creating Peaks Recovery Center's outcome data, so I'm really excited to bring Joanna on. In the meantime, send us your thoughts, ideas, questions, finding Peaks at peaksrecovery.com. Find us on the Facebook, the Instagram, podcast, the Gmails. All the, all
Hotmail.
all the fun.
Netscape.
AOL.
Yeah, Spotify. There's another one for the podcast. Love you all. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.